All right, we're going to continue on and discuss in a little bit more detail the various types of epithelial tissues, and we're going to see how you can put together those cell shape and cell layering names to name particular types of epithelial tissues, and we'll see some examples of where they are located. As we're going through these, pay attention to the descriptions that we're discussing. And then also the functions, so these different types of epithelial tissues are associated with particular kinds of functions in the body, even though they may be located in different organs. You remember, all the organs in your body are built from a fairly limited number of types of tissues. They're just woven together in different patterns and in different locations to give those organs their particular functions. And then also, pay attention to some of the example locations where you would expect to find these particular kinds of tissues. All right, so this is a diagram from your textbook, which is showing you simple squamous epithelium, an example of that type of tissue. So simple, remember what that means from the first lecture. That means you have one layer of cells. The whole tissue is just one layer of cells. And then what did we say? Squamous meant, think squamous like squash or squished. These are flat cells. And if you look over here, here's a pretty nice little 3D representation of a simple squamous epithelial tissue and what that would look like. So you can see those cells, like there's one cell right there, the little dark purple spot on the inside is the nucleus. So they really are flat. They're like pancake flat. All right, so and then underneath there you'll have a little thin basal lamina. That's like that little glue that's there to cause that simple squamous tissue to adhere or stick to whatever underlying tissues you have underneath it. All right, so where do you have these? So if you think about super thin tissues, I mean microscopically thin, these are going to be really good for passage of materials. If you think about that, by diffusion or filtering substances that need to move from one compartment to another. You're not going to find these, if you look on here, where protection is important. These are very delicate type tissues. They can get damaged really easily because they're so super thin. Also, this last little thing here on the function secretes lubricating substances in your serosi. That serosi is another name for your serous membranes. So we said those consist of epithelial tissue, so they're simple squamous epithelial tissue, and then that is attached to a thin layer of connective tissue to make up the entire serous membrane. And those those epithelial cells there in the serous membrane secrete the fluid that you find in the cavities where those membranes line. All right, so any place in the body where you need to allow passage of gases or solutes, if it's from one fluid location to another, that's where you're going to find these super thin, simple squamous epithelial tissues. So some example locations: kidney glomeruli. Those are the tissues in your kidneys that are involved in urine formation. Urine is filtered blood. Air sacs of the lungs, that's a really good example to remember, because your lungs are filled with these little tiny microscopic air sacs, and they're roughly spherical in shape. So if you think about, if you cut one of those open, like if you cut like a tennis ball open and you were looking at the edges of the tennis ball here, and you have air there in the center, so those edges there that make up the wall of the air sac, just like you would have the walls of a tennis ball, those are made up of these super flat tissues like you see over here. And this is actually a microscopic image if you were looking under a microscope at these air sacs in the lungs cut open, just like if you cut open a tennis ball and you were looking at them in 2D and looking at the edges of the air sacs there. There's one. This would be another air sac over here. And in purple, what you're seeing there, and again, this is like looking at this under a microscope magnified 125 times. You can see how super thin that wall is. because it's built, the wall is just built from a single layer of these flat cells, and so they are good for allowing things like oxygen gas to pass across, and then CO2, carbon dioxide gas, to move out of the blood and into those little air sacs so that you can exhale that out of your lungs. So any place in the body like that where you need to move substances across easily, your blood vessels. So the blood brings oxygen and nutrients to all the tissues in your body, so oxygen and nutrients have to move in and out of the blood fairly easily. So those smallest blood vessels are going to be lined with these simple squamous epithelial type tissues. All right, a couple of other locations where you would find these simple squamous tissues. Now, what I was just talking about, the inside lining of blood vessels, that innermost lining is a simple squamous epithelial tissue. Actually, the lining of the chambers of the heart, simple squamous epithelial tissue. And if you remember your lymphatic vessels, talked a little bit about the lymphatic system back in chapter 1. And those are also lined with simple squamous epithelial tissues. Very thin, very delicate. Another term I think you guys should be familiar with, mesothelium. When you see that, that term actually, that prefix refers to middle, and then thelium refers to an epithelium of some type. That is another term for the serous membranes, the epithelial portion of the serous membranes, mesothelium. Where you will typically hear that is mesothelioma. Maybe you know somebody who has been diagnosed with a mesothelioma. That is a type of cancer that develops within a serous membrane. Usually it's a type of lung cancer. It's the serous membrane around the lungs that becomes cancerous, and so you have cells that are dividing out of control and forming tumors. That's a mesothelioma. Endothelium up here, I forgot to mention that. The inside lining of lymphatic vessels, blood vessels in the heart can also be called an endothelium, because that's an epithelial tissue. You have a lining, an inside space in the body that does not have any opening to the outside. All right, another combination between layering and cell-shaped names, that we have simple cuboidal. Okay, and simple means we have just one layer of cells. Cuboidal, the cells are cube-shaped, and so there's a nice little representation of simple cuboidal epithelium like you would find in some locations in the body. Still fairly thin, not as thin as simple squamous. And some places where you would find these in the kidneys, there are some tiny microscopic tubes in there called kidney tubules that are also involved in urine formation. You would find those there. Some of your smallest glands in the body have simple cuboidal tissues, and actually the surfaces of the ovaries have, the outer surface of each ovary is actually covered with, because organs can be covered, they're covered with epithelial tissues as well. And you have those in that location. And this is over here, so your textbook has some pretty nice, these are actual microscopic images. If you were looking at these tissues, like a tissue slice, a super, super thin slice of tissue on a microscope, looking at it on a slide, and then they apply these dyes, usually red or pinkish red and purplish blue dyes, to help light up the cells so that you can see them really clearly. This is what you would see if you cut through a tissue like that in the kidneys. You're cutting through a series of three-dimensional tubes. You're slicing through that with a knife, and what you would see, you can see like right there, there's a cube-shaped cell, there's another one, there's another one, there's another one over here, here's another one over here. So they're not perfect cubes, but they're pretty close. And what you're looking at there is like, let's see, if I rolled this, I'm not going to be able to roll this up too well. Got a piece of paper here. You have a tubule that's a little microscopic sized tube, but you have tons of them in your kidneys. They're involved in urine formation. And what you're seeing is you take a blade and pass it through a whole bunch of those tubes at once, and you're looking at these tubes on end. That's a cross-section of the tube. And so what you're looking at is the wall there, and you're seeing those cube-shaped cells in the wall. All right, another type of epithelial tissue you can have, simple columnar epithelial tissues. Simple, one layer, columnar, the cells are shaped like columns. And there's an example. A major place where you would find these is along the inside lining of the much of the digestive tract, especially from the stomach all the way down to the anus. So these cells are often involved in absorption, secretion of things like mucus, enzymes like digestive enzymes to help you break down the nutrients that you've taken in. And here's actually a microscopic image over here. You're looking at some real ones. So like right there, there's one cell. The darker spots there, that's a nucleus. Here's another columnar-shaped cell. You're seeing them in 2D because you've got a microscopic, thin tissue slice through a portion of the small intestine. And so in here, this would be space inside the small intestine there. And when you study the digestive tissue in detail, you'll see that the epithelial lining there wiggles back and forth a lot. So that's why you're seeing two portions of it right here, right next to each other, because of the way it wiggles and waves around back and forth there along the intestinal lining. But you can see there you just have one layer of epithelial cells, and underneath here, this is going to be connective tissue within the wall of the small intestine. If you remember, we took a look at that on a diagram back on the first video lecture for this particular unit. All right, another type of epithelial tissue you can have. This one's more unusual. So that one was a simple columnar. The next one is called pseudostratified columnar epithelium. So columnar, we already know that means the cells have a columnar shape and there's a nucleus. Now stratified, we said, meant layers. You have multiple layers, several layers of cells that make up the epithelial tissue. And what does pseudo mean? If you've heard that prefix before, that actually means false. So a pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium looks like it's stratified if you looked at it under the microscope, but it's really not. It's actually just one layer of cells. And here's a chunk of a pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium. And what happens is these cells are all twisted around each other in kind of odd ways. So if you're looking at the tissue under the microscope, the nuclei wind up appearing at many different levels. And because of that, if you look at it, you think, oh, look at this. This is a stratified, a multi-layered series of cells, but in reality, it is just one layer. They're just all twisted and contorted around each other. Locations. So you have non-ciliated types in a male sperm-carrying ducts. Whenever you hear that term duct, that is a tube that is carrying some sort of secreted substance. So if you think like the vas deferens, which carries sperm from the testes in the male toward the urethra so that they can exit out of the body, that space is going to be lined with pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissues. Usually, though, when we're thinking about this type of tissue, we're thinking about the inside lining of the trachea and much of the rest of your upper respiratory tract. That is lined with these columnar epithelial cells that are all twisted around each other, and they are ciliated, which means, and this is a really good little microscopic image here, those little hair-like things, those are the cilia, and those are actually built from proteins, and what they do is they whip back and forth, and they help when, like if you breathe in germs and dust, those get down into your trachea. These cilia sweep upward, so the mucus that's present there, all that slimy mucus that's present there along the surface will trap dust and germs, and the cilia sweep them upward, so it sweeps them back up towards the pharynx, so that you'll either cough that stuff out or you'll swallow it and it'll go sliding down your esophagus into your stomach acid and kill any bacteria or viruses or whatever have gotten down into your trachea. So that's what those cilia do. All right, and this is an actual microscopic image. If you were studying these in the laboratory, like there's a cell, there's a nucleus, there's another cell over here, and you know, every place you see a nucleus, that's representing one individual cell. And it doesn't look like one layer, though it really is. Those cells are just all twisted around each other. And then down in here you would have your basal lamina or basement membrane. That's another term for that. And beneath there you would have connective tissue there in the wall of the trachea. All right, how about another type? Stratified squamous epithelium. Stratified means many layers. Squamous, flat cells, and we're going to hear a lot about stratified squamous epithelium when we do Chapter 5 on the skin, because the uppermost layer of the skin is composed of stratified squamous epithelium. So you got lots of flat epithelial cells, and they're jam-packed together in many layers. So you have those on the skin. You also have them, though, in many other locations, like inside the mouth, the inside lining of your mouth there, stratified squamous epithelium. The esophagus, the vaginal lining, you're going to have these. All right, so remember when we were discussing simple squamous epithelial tissues, we said those were really delicate. You would not find those at places where you need protection. You need protection from abrasion and friction and things like that. Stratified squamous epithelial tissues, you are going to have those at places where you need a thicker lining and something that's going to resist friction and rubbing, and you know, like when you're chewing foods and foods are rubbing up against the lining in there, you don't want those tissues being too easily damaged. So any place like that where you need extra protection, you'll have stratified squamous type epithelial tissues. Okay, and then what about transitional epithelium? That's the last type. This is an interesting type. Transitional epithelium occurs in, let's just talk about where it occurs first. Lines your ureters, urinary bladder, and part of the urethra. So you're going to find that in the urinary system on the inside lining. Now if you think about those structures like the inside of your bladder is going to expand as it fills up with urine. All right, so think about the epithelial tissue that's lining the inside surface of the bladder. So when the bladder doesn't have a lot of urine in it, those cells are unstretched, but as that bladder expands, that epithelial lining you see over here is going to get stretched out. Okay, so the cells will look more cuboidal or columnar when the bladder is empty, but those cells get stretched out and look all stretched out and squished and squamous as the bladder fills up with urine. So because of that, that epithelial tissue changes shapes. So it undergoes a transition, and that's where it gets its name, transitional epithelium. All right, so that's an overview of your different types of epithelial tissue. Quite a bit of this information is going to overlap with the anatomy you need to know from Chapter 4, which is mainly going to consist of being able to recognize some of these different example tissues. But I will go back over that in more detail for the anatomy portions of Unit 2. The next lecture will be about the special case of the glands of the body, which are also built from epithelial tissue, so we'll do that one next.